So first, I want to thank all of you for coming. It's great to see some familiar faces and some others, and it's great to be at one of my favorite bookstores. I've been coming here for a long time, so I appreciate the invitation. It's really appropriate for us to talk about the role of Washington, D.C. here in the Capitol in the midst of the sesquicentennial of the Civil War. The sesquicentennial commemorates 150 years of the Civil War, which lasted 4 bloody years and captured the lives of more than 700,000 Americans, North and South. And when we think about the Civil War, it's typically with a sense of the divisive relationship between North and South and the violence that captured the nation well before the war began. Men from the North and men from the South became angry and angrier, challenging one another with words and with guns over the issue of slavery. And Washington, D.C. has long served as sort of the epicenter of that discussion. When we think of the coming of the Civil War, probably our most common picture is of the caning of Charles Sumner, an anti-slavery senator from Massachusetts, by South Carolina Congressman Preston Brooks on the floor of the Senate in 1856. And I'm going to talk a little bit about this in a minute. But tonight I want to talk about how the picture of Washington as violent and divisive is actually misleading. Instead, the real key to understanding Washington in the mid-19th century is to recognize that in many ways it operated more like a social fraternity, hence the name Washington Brotherhood. Politicians came to Washington from around the country, to a city that does not look much like what we see today. It was dirty, it was dusty, it was gross. It was not a vacation destination. Depending upon the session, they would spend up to 9 months living together in hotels and boarding houses scattered across Pennsylvania Avenue from the Capitol up to the White House. They talked to each other at parties and at balls and state dinners and at hotel bars across the city, as well as in social and religious clubs. And I want to highlight 2 key consequences of this close-knit Washington community. First, it produced something like a social and political code in Washington, a set of norms for political behavior that those outside the capital city really didn't understand. Even those people who didn't really like each other much tended to treat each other in the same way as you would imagine a fraternity to operate. You kept things in the family. Second, the experiences of living in Washington often insulated politicians from the outside world. They understood the sectional conflicts of the mid-19th century in the context of cross-sectional cooperation in Washington. What this meant in practice for the antebellum period was that many Southern politicians were simply unprepared for the speed at which secession took hold in the winter of 1860-1861. So depending upon your view of Washington, you might even call this inside the Beltway mentality before the Beltway even existed. So I just want to highlight these 2 features of Washington society in the mid-19th century, the role of the social code and the ways in which politicians were isolated, with a couple of stories. And then hopefully you'll have some questions for me. So let me start with the social and political code of Washington, and particularly the code that existed in the Capitol itself. When we think about congressional policymaking in the 21st century, we generally think about Capitol Hill and maybe even the Capitol itself as the place where politicians give important speeches and hammer out deals. This may surprise you, but in the 19th century, almost none of that happened in the Capitol itself. And there were a number of reasons for this, and I'm just going to focus on the House of Representatives here to make my points a little bit easier to illustrate. In the antebellum period, the House of Representatives averaged about 240 men coming from all regions of the country, and it was very hard to corral all these men, attentive and sober, to listen to a speech in the House of Representatives. It was sometimes hard to maintain a quorum, a majority of the members of the House. There was no system of bells like there is today where you could sort of get people to come in and take their seats. Typically, except in cases of an important vote or a very, very famous speaker, you only had about 2/3 of the House in session. The rest of the politicians were out of town, or they were hanging out elsewhere in Washington. Many of the exciting bars and brothels and other places in the area. Or they could be in the Capitol getting drunk at the Hole in the Wall, which was a little tavern in the basement of the Capitol. If you were unlucky enough to get a seat at the back of the House, you probably couldn't hear what was going on. Remember, there were no microphones in the mid-19th century, and when you have that many people, you're not going to be able to hear as well. The acoustics in the House were not very good. People complained about this. And if you got one of the seats at the back, you were just out of luck. Those in the House itself were also not necessarily paying attention. And this is an important part of thinking about the way that Washington politicians understood what was around them. When you were living as a politician in the 19th century, you did not have a staff the way you would today, right? You didn't have people who were taking care of your correspondence, who were keeping in touch with your constituents. So you had to do all of that yourself, which meant that a lot of times it happened in the Capitol itself. People would write letters home. They would write letters to their wives. They wouldn't pay attention to what was actually going on the floor. They would be corresponding. And if they didn't feel like listening, they could just talk to their neighbors or sleep or whatever they would want to do. Congressmen generally didn't feel bad about ignoring these speeches because the real politicking did not happen in the Capitol itself. As a result, most of what happened in the Capitol fell into a category of 19th century speech-making that congressmen called bunkum speech-making. The origin of the word bunk comes from this. The definition of bunkum speech-making was basically giving a speech on a bill or an amendment that basically had nothing to do with what was going on in the House itself, but was strictly made for the purpose of pleasing your constituents. And every congressman in the 19th century made bunkum speeches, frequently. This was part of the experience of living in Washington and understanding the way things worked. You wanted to please your constituents, and so you would make these bunkum speeches. In fact, it was so well accepted that congressmen would make bunkum speeches that sometimes they wouldn't even make the speeches. They would write them out and hand them over to the Congressional Record reporter, and the reporter would put them in the Congressional Record. Nobody complained about this because this was part of the experience of working in Washington, of working in the House. This was a part of the Congressional Code. So we have to think about how Washington operated as being outside the Capitol itself. One more important aspect of this Washington Fraternal Code takes us back to Charles Sumner. And I just want to remind you a little bit of the details of the caning of Charles Sumner. It's a particularly colorful moment in our history. There had been much fighting in Kansas as a result of the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. And in 1856, it had gotten particularly violent. And Charles Sumner, a Massachusetts senator, got up in the Senate and delivered a speech that was very much accusatory of the South. He called it the rape of Kansas, that slavery men were going into Kansas and trying to influence the votes there. He also said some pretty nasty things about a man named Andrew Pickens Butler, who was a senator from South Carolina. Butler's cousin was serving in the House at this time. He was a man by the name of Preston Brooks. And Brooks did not take kindly to this. He did not hear the speech, but he read about it, and he thought this was a problem. So he decided to confront Sumner. Sumner, completely unwittingly, avoided Brooks for some time. It just happened that they passed each other at times where Brooks couldn't go to speak to him. And after a couple of days of this, Brooks got very angry. He waited for Sumner at the back of the Senate, and he went up to him once the galleries were clear and struck him over the head with his cane more than 30 times. Sumner fell into the aisleway in the Senate and had to leave the Senate for some months to